There was a very small little trade publication that did a ranking of the 100 most influential people involved in technology in New York City. And somehow I got ranked 96th. And not a huge achievement. The magazine later went out of business, as did we. But at the time, I realized I had two choices. I could spend the rest of my life working my way up the list, or I could cancel my subscription. And after 5 years of 60-hour days, it seemed, with my limited imagination, the best I could come up with was canceling my subscription and buying a ticket to a little island in the Pacific and seeing if I could sort of reset my life.
That was Alex Sheshunoff, a disarmingly funny author who's been featured in Slate, National Geographic Adventure, Marketplace on NPR, and he spends a lot of time talking with me here about his funny book. It's actually a true story. It's called A Beginner's Guide to Paradise, 9 Steps to Giving Up Everything So You Too Can, Move to a Pacific Island, Wear a Loincloth, Read 100 Books, Build a Bungalow, Diaper a Baby Monkey, and maybe, just maybe, fall in love. Individual results may vary, baby monkey not included. It's a really good interview. Keep on listening. 2, 3, 4. Well, hello there, podcast people. John here. You're listening to episode 7 of Make Moves. And if you all don't mind, I'm just going to take a second to celebrate. I made it to my 7th episode. As someone who has started and not finished a handful of projects in his life, I'm really thrilled that I'm still doing this. This is not like the wilted lettuce in my refrigerator that never made it into a salad. This is not like the half-learned songs that I never quite finished on guitar. This is something that is a labor of love. I keep doing it. I keep having fun. If you're still listening, I hope you're enjoying yourself. And I want to thank everyone who's participated so far. I've got 5 more interviews booked up, and that's going to get me through the end of season 1. And after that, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm assuming season 2, maybe with some improvements, but I'm just going to take this moment and enjoy where we are. So thanks, everybody. Really glad that we're here together. And if you'd like to drop me a line, I always love getting emails. Just shoot one off to feedback@makemoveswithjohn.com. Or you can just swing by the website, makemoveswithjohn.com. Or if you want to search us out on Facebook or Instagram, Make Moves with John. Or we're also on Twitter, Make Moves W John. I also have a Beam and Snapchat account, but to be honest, I don't use them because I'm afraid my head will explode. Anyway, I'm here. I hope you'll reach out because I sure would love to talk to you and hear what you're thinking. So we're on episode 7. Let's get on to this interview with Alex Sheshunoff. He's a really bright guy and really funny. I think you'll enjoy what he's got to say. I'll check in with you about the halfway point to play a little music. Until then, I'm going to turn off the mic. You turn on your ears. Have fun. Thanks for coming on the show here. Really appreciate it. Where are you right now?
I'm in San Diego, California, USA.
Okay. Last time I spoke with you, you were in Anchorage, Alaska.
Yeah, that's right. We're making our way south. My wife's from San Diego, so we're just visiting here. And you're out of Santa Barbara, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Great. There are worse places to live probably than Santa Barbara.
Yeah, there are. I'm pretty happy where I am. Well, I want to ask you, start a little bit about your book. Can you tell me and the listeners maybe the elevator pitch about what is your book about?
Well, in short, it's a true story, and it's got a lot of jokes, but it's about a brief time in my life when I was burnt out and facing a quarter-life crisis after working at a job in New York. That I bought a one-way ticket to a small island in the Pacific called Yap, and brought with me the 100 books I was most embarrassed not to have read. And while out there, ended up meeting a girl and, of course, writing my own book, which is this one.
Well, then that makes sense. I read the whole book, by the way. Mm-hmm. I'm proud to report that I read the whole thing as preparation, and I really enjoyed all of it. It's something I noticed while reading, little basic things. The format was a little bit different than I think any other true book I've ever read. It was, there was some introductory questions, and there was these interwoven little lessons and big lessons about life. Those questions at the beginning of each chapter, was that like an innovation of yours, or did Did you sort of crib that format from somewhere?
Well, I can't claim to have invented the idea of a question.
Oh yeah, okay, well, fair enough.
But it was actually an idea I got from a college roommate of mine. For all 4 years, he always wrote the same term paper, regardless of what the actual assignment was. And what he wrote was, "What did I learn from reading this book?" And sometimes the teachers loved it, sometimes they hated it. He either got like a D or an A+ on every assignment. But I did like the idea of sort of presenting to the reader, like, well, what can they expect to learn from this chapter? And I should say there's a lot of sugar to help just a little bit of medicine go down. So while there are some lessons, it's primarily just hopefully an entertaining story.
Yeah, I have to tell you, it felt like a breadcrumb trail, these little questions to lead me through the story. And then every once in a while on the breadcrumb trail, there was maybe a cinnamon roll-sized life lesson to learn. So I really enjoyed it. Thanks. For the unsophisticated reader like me, I really appreciated the leading there. Your book, it starts with you in your previous life. You sort of alluded to that already. You were in New York. You were in the startup world. You were at a company that you started called the People, which I thought in and of itself was kind of interesting. Could you just tell us, what was that company? And I read it was described as the nonpartisan precursor to MoveOn.org. What did you do? What were you setting out to do there?
Well, I should say right from the front that it was the late '90s, and back then you could have an internet company that had a pun in its name, so it seemed okay back then. But basically, we were just a software company that enabled visitors to newspaper websites to communicate with their government officials. So if you read an article about, I don't know, all the problems with the parks in a city or something, at the end of the article, you could send an email or start a petition to the parks commissioner of your little town. And it seemed like a good idea, and it took a lot of work. and for a while, it went really well. We were venture backed and had an office in Soho in New York City with a ping pong table, like every cliche, right? And then about 5 years into it, there was a very small little trade publication that did a ranking of the 100 most influential people involved in technology in New York City. And somehow I got ranked 96th. And not a huge achievement. The magazine later went out of business, as did we. But at the time, I realized I had two choices. I could spend the rest of my life working my way up the list, or I could cancel my subscription. And after 5 years of 60-hour days, it seemed, with my limited imagination, the best I could come up with was canceling my subscription and buying a ticket to a little island in the Pacific and seeing if I could sort of reset my life.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, that's bold. So, I mean, you had this falling out of sorts with a previous lifestyle. And, I mean, it sounds like something happened and you basically said, screw it, I'm out of here. I'm going to go discover paradise, which is maybe the genesis of this book. But I'm wondering, it sounds funny looking back at it now, to me anyway, but did any of it seem like a well-reasoned idea to you at the time?
No, it didn't. It's giving it all up and moving to a South Pacific island is not not the most original idea. But I do think a lot of people do have this notion of sort of giving it all up and getting away from it all. And I realized at the time that my life wasn't so terrible, John. I had a job and an apartment in New York, and it wasn't turn your life upside down bad, but I was worried that in 30 years it would be. 30 years of pursuing goals that weren't mine, 30 goals pursuing something that maybe I didn't even really want, would be too late to turn my life upside down. So I just decided to make a break for it.
Huh. Was your family or friends, were they supportive of this, or did you just sort of get a blessing and
Yeah. Well, they tended to fall in a couple of different categories. One was, I've always wanted to do that. Let me know how it goes. Most were sort of in the middle of like, okay. They didn't really have there was no sort of actual script that I was following, and they didn't really know how it was going to play out. And then there were reactions more along the lines of my mother's, she was like, I'm worried that you're going to wake up in somebody else's soup.
Right.
And I was like, Mom, that was like that Rockefeller guy, and that was like 60 years ago. And she said, well, he didn't think he was going to wake up in somebody's soup either. I said, yeah, I know. Okay. Anyways, but it was at the time it was just this really organic thing. I know sometimes people set out to sort of change their life and write a book about it. Like I'm going to only wear blue for a year and see how it changed me as a person. This was just something that I felt like I needed to do, and it was only later that I realized it was possibly a story that other people could be interested in.
Huh. When you were sort of getting on the plane off to Yap, there's all this stuff that must have been scary. Where did this reservoir of fearlessness come from?
I wouldn't characterize it that way, John. There was plenty of fear, but I worked. Yap, for most people don't know where that is. It's just it's in the far western Pacific, so it's about 800 miles south of Guam. And I chose it because I was Googling one night at my office. I typed in nice Pacific Island, and it turns out there are like 29,000 nice Pacific Islands. And so then I honed my search and typed in really nice Pacific Island. And Yap came up. It was this place that was described as being sort of still traditional. They used stone money. They spoke English. But I thought, and going back to your question, I thought, well, if I don't like it, if it doesn't work, I can always work my way back east. But at least I'll start there and see how it goes. But there was plenty of fear at the time.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm glad to know that you were at least a little afraid. I mean, the book is super entertaining, but it sounds like sort of a nuts move to make. So, congratulations on doing it.
Well, thanks. One of the things I realized right away was that if you're ever afraid of taking a big step like this, you should always leave the country from Newark, because you'll be reminded that you're making the right choice.
In the first few chapters of the book, you sort of describe your dabbling interest in politics. Part of that was maybe the focus of your startup, but you also shared some funny, entertaining stories about taking candy from legislators, and I think there was one in there about Bob Dole at an ice cream social or something like that. I really found these stories, they almost sounded like stories of becoming disillusioned. They were hilarious, but there was one that really, it caught my eye. It was about, I think you were working with Ann Richards on a re-election campaign in Texas. And there was something about you had helped work on a questionnaire that was sent to her. Can you share a little bit of that story?
Yeah, sure. This is my only contribution to world history. Happened when I was about 19 or 20. I was working in the press office for Governor Ann Richards. She was the governor of Texas, and her opponent was a 1% owner of a local baseball team, George W. Bush. And I answered the phone one day, and there was a representative of an organization called Project Vote Smart, and they're doing a survey of candidates and where they stood on different issues. And they said, the person told me, they said, well, the George W. Bush team has filled this out, and you guys haven't filled it out. Are you still not taking a position on the issues? And I said, well, give me a second, and I'll call you back. So I went to the head of the press office, and he said, we don't really fill those things out because we can't articulate sort of our more nuanced positions on the issues. It's either black or white, and there's no gray. And I said, well, I think it's really important. I think we should fill this out. And he said, well, if you feel so strongly about it, go talk to the head of the campaign. And I did. And she told me the exact same thing. There's no gray area here in these surveys. And I said, I think it's really important. She said, okay, well, go talk to the governor's lawyer. So I went to talk to the governor's lawyer, and he told me the same thing. And he said, well, if you want, you can talk to the governor about it. So I sat down with Governor Ann Richards, and she said the same thing. But she said, look, if you really want to do it, fine, we'll fill it out. And one of the questions was, does the candidate support an increase in state spending? And we said yes, and then wrote in the margins, but only for education. Well, it turns out that Project Vote Smart had not been straightforward. The George W. Bush team had not filled out the survey, but they did see our answer, and they ended up sending a letter out to 5 million people saying that Governor Richard supports an increase in state spending. We lost the election by like 3 million votes. I don't think I was the only contributing factor, but I did have a role to play, and I'm sorry for everybody who feels like that was it didn't work out the way it should have.
Yeah, I'm sort of curious. I mean, that sounds like one of those moments where you realize you can't actually tell the truth. You can't put anything in parentheses in the margins. It doesn't matter. I'm wondering, you probably had a few lessons like that, but did it sting a little bit when you realized that the world is maybe a little bit screwed up or certainly not fair?
Wow.
Or have you realized that? I hate to assume you have realized it.
At the time it took a few months for that all to unfold. And it was only after we lost that I thought, oh my God, did I play a role in that? Maybe it was my naivete. I mean, it's definitely my naivete, but at the time it was part of the Republican Revolution, and they took over a lot of state houses and Congress. But yeah, it probably made me a little more cynical about the way that we can affect change, but not so much that I didn't later start either people. I guess I still had this faith, and I guess, and probably still do, that that democracy more or less works. Okay. We'll find out this November.
Yes, we will. In your book, you called out a guy named Tyler, who was a friend in your old life. I mean, you kind of called him out as being sort of a prick, actually. And I assume maybe you changed his name, or maybe you didn't. But this whole book is about you moving on to a new life. But in the process of writing it, it sounds like, that's maybe the smallest bridge you might have burned, but you might have burned a few behind you. Did you have that sensation of sort of stating the truth from your perspective? Was there no going back after putting this in writing?
Yeah, there were a couple of moments there where I thought, oh God, somebody might read this. But I kind of go back to that Joan Didion quote where she said, "Character is a willingness to accept responsibility for your own actions." Mm-hmm. And the case of Tyler, who's this guy, I did actually change his name because it's not my choice whether or not he should accept responsibility for his own actions. But he'll probably, I don't know if he's read it or not. But the moment you're talking about it I was in New York City, and I went out to dinner with this guy, and rather than wait for the bill, he just put down $100 bill on the table and walked out. And for him, time was more valuable than money, and if he was overpaying, that was worthwhile for him. So I realized then that, oh man, maybe New York City is not the place for me. And obviously it's a huge place, and there's a real diversity of folks, but a lot of it is sort of driven by the acquisition and spending of money, and it wasn't feeling right.
Uh-huh. So in your book, as you're somewhere in the Pacific, I noticed this one quote, and you said, "Since leaving New York, I decided to only ask questions that I actually cared about the answers to." And do you remember writing that by any chance?
It's funny. I remember feeling that way, and I still do feel that way, but I don't remember actually writing that down.
Okay. I was wondering if there was maybe a certain moment that, triggered a decision like that, or was that just sort of a cumulative process in life where you...
Yeah. There was at some point in my life, I realized that the problem with small talk, and I recognize the value that it does serve, but the real issue with it is that people are asking questions they don't care about. And so if you only ask things that you really want to know the answer to, then every conversation becomes engaging and potentially meaningful. I mean, and also uncomfortable. But I've tried to stick with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've met you, I think maybe once or twice in person through a mutual friend. And, both times I met you, you seemed like a, smart, mild-mannered, considerate, inquisitive guy. But as
it's all an act, John.
Well, yeah, I mean, so as I was reading about your adventures out there in the islands, I realized that you were a bit bolder, and you have sort of a mischievous streak in you. And I want to say that I wouldn't have expected it, because I don't know if I know you well enough to if I have expected anything. But this mischievous streak, I'm wondering, is that something you blossomed into, or did you always have that, or did just suddenly being completely out of your element make you free to do that?
You know, I think it comes from my dad, and this isn't in the book, but there was one moment that I had as a kid that ended up making a big impression on me, and that was there was a country club a couple miles from our house, and my parents found out that they were having a cocktail party or a dinner dance or something, and my dad, who was from southern Arkansas and sort of mischievous himself, he decided that rather than go to this event, I'm not sure he was invited anyways, but that he went to a hunting supply store and bought a tape recorder with a speaker on it, and then that was used for like attracting ducks to a blind or something. Anyways, and then he found this cassette tape of mountain lions mating. And together he took me, and I was like, again, like a young kid, like, I don't know, 8. Anyway, so he had us hide in the bushes as people were walking into this dinner dance in their like Central Texas in the 80s cocktail attire. And then he would start playing the tape, and it sounded just like you would imagine mountain lions mating to sound, like screeching and roaring. But it was a sort of a reverence towards authority and pretense that sort of has stuck with me, I think.
I think it's charming. At least the stories in the book are charming. Hopefully I'll never have it directed at me at a cocktail party or something. In your book, there's this one section where you're talking about a type of dedication to getting across a specific 500-mile stretch of water. And there was this urgency to your attitude about having to get somewhere. And I found this quote: "I just had to find a way to get across 500 miles of open ocean. If I didn't, who knows, maybe someday I too would find myself racing through airports to get someplace that I didn't really want to go." And, so personally, I felt that quote in my soul. But I was wondering, you're out there doing this huge adventure of a lifetime, but did you have an equal pull and push to go on this adventure? I mean, it sounds like you were escaping and also aspiring, or was there more of a pull or push?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think it was some of both. I was pushed by my former life in New York, and I was also pulled to this idea of paradise. And my idea at the time was kind of like most people's ideas. It was like part like screensaver, part Far Side cartoon, part like Robinson Crusoe. But my feeling was, or my thesis was that an ideal life, with time to sort of to read and reflect and be the person you want to be, isn't something that people back into. It's something that you have to make some plans for, some arrangements, and take some risks. And so I had this like sort of Paul Gauguin sort of idea in my mind, and I thought, oh man, maybe there is a perfect island out there, paradise with a capital P, and maybe it was still there, like on this. If I could just find the right island, the right valley, and the right island, I could create this sort of perfect life. And so, so I was pushed and I was pulled, and I started off in Yap and realized pretty soon that a place with like no beaches and a growing leprosy problem wasn't really the paradise I had envisioned. Yeah. And so I'd heard about these outer islands of Yap that you can only get to by freighter ship, and I thought, well, maybe that's where my paradise was.
So, I mean, really, all in all, for our listeners out there, this book is hilarious. I want to make a confession too. There's a bunch of pictures in the center of the book glossy pictures embedded inside of, I don't know, about 250 pages on either side of text. And as an adult reader, I still always want to skip past all of the words to the pictures. And I wanted to compliment you that I actually read all the words straight through to the pictures. And actually, I think it was a break in the middle of a sentence from one paragraph to the next. So I kept reading more words, and I went back to the pictures. So anyone out there who's listening, if you have a tendency towards wanting to look at pictures, the words are so good. You'll too want to keep reading.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's like getting an endorsement from a guy who can't read or something.
I'll take it.
Okay. If you don't mind, I want to go down a slightly different path of some questions here. I mean, you come from a fairly successful family. I think your father's kind of a well-known figure in some part of the banking industry. And, you've accomplished a lot. And I also know that as I'm reading about some of this stuff, the outside cover of your book and little spots on your website, you're very cautious to not brag about some of your accomplishments. You say things like, I snuck through Yale. You described yourself, I think, as a writer-like kind of person, although you have articles in top publications, and you went to University of Iowa, I think, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the top writing program in the United States. You started a company with a goal of actually changing how politics works.
Okay. Keep going.
Yeah.
Move along.
Yeah. And it sounds like I've made you uncomfortable. I guess what I'm curious is, you downplay a lot of that so much, but then when you're talking about your adventures in this book and actually your courtship of this lovely woman in the book, you talk about it with such pride. And I'm kind of wondering, is it just easier for you to connect with those prideful things because they were meaningful to you? Or are you just uncomfortable with the fact that you're good at accomplishing things too?
Well, I don't know how well a book titled My Years at Yale would sell.
Yeah.
I don't know. For me, like writing this book, I do feel like there, as I said, there are some lessons there that I think are good ones, and that I was proud and happy to share. But I also know that, as somebody said once, like nobody really wants to hear about your trip unless you were the victim of a crime. Oh. and so for me, I feel like all the lessons and the story itself is a privilege that I had to earn from the reader. And so, I wanted to tell the story in the most sort of compelling and hopefully occasionally, humorous way as possible. Because for me, the competition is fierce, not just other books, but I'm like, when I'm at my computer, I'm thinking about like Game of Thrones, like I gotta be better than like a crew of 1,500 and a huge budget, that's tough. And so, so it was a story. It was really fun to tell, and it was a privilege to get to tell it.
All right, this here is Tacuma Bradley's Unity Band. You're listening to the song Let It Ride off the album Joint Effort.
You just gotta let it ride, let it slide right off instead of get inside. At the showdown, yeah, we show love. When it goes down, yeah, we show up. Been praying for my enemies lately. Though they hurt me, though they hate me, I wish them well instead of walking around angry. Cause that character, nah, it ain't me. I'm trying to build up, not destroy. Rocking that glow, yeah, beyond my Bruce Leroy. I'm paying attention to the what's now. I'm listening more to the silence instead of what's loud. Plus how they try to keep us all divided, off balance, off rhythm. So we give them the best challenge when we step back, try to respond instead of react. Put the seat back and let the universe drive. Just let it ride.
Now you live in Ojai, California, and I think you spent a lot of time in Alaska after leaving the Pacific, or the Pacific Islands out there. You have a wonderful wife, and I think you have a couple of kids, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm curious. Now you're at a different space in your life. How do you feel about things like risk now that you have a lot of other stuff on the line?
Oh, risk is such an interesting topic, John. Wow, that I've thought about maybe even writing a book about risk. And for your listeners, don't worry, I'm not going to just like ramble on about risk in a book length form now. But it's amazing to me how personal and important one's relationship to risk is with the sort of kinds of choices that we make. Don't you think? What's your take on risk?
Well, I personally think I'm trying to learn about risk by asking people like you. So I think, I feel like there's a time and place for risk, and as people have more skin in the game, there's the risk just gets exponentially higher in things like families and households and the jobs that maybe you don't have time to recreate a new career if you quit when you're 40 versus 20. I think they shift a lot, but I also think that when you're young, you're usually not prone to going out on a limb, but you also don't realize what risks you're going to encounter when you get later in life. I feel like I'm mumbling now, but I'm really curious. You took a lot of risks early on, and they're beautifully documented here in this book, and it sounds like you've maybe taken some others, but do you feel like risk is a part of your lifestyle that you just have to hold on to? Or now that you've got kids and a family and, you've sort of settled into are you just in the next phase and now you just sort of service life, or do you,
Oh, no. I really try to avoid the word settle.
Uh-huh.
I am in the next phase, but we have not hopefully I've not settled down in everything that implies, but you're right. As we age, our tolerance for risk seems to go down, and I was reading some research recently that is actually documented. But it's always seemed to me that as you get older, like your tolerance should go up because there are less long-term consequences as the long-term becomes shorter and shorter term. But to actually do that, I think part of what happens is that the way the human brain works is that we hear something. Sometimes it's like science-based and study-based. Other times it's anecdotal. Like you'll hear man attacked by bear in the woods, and you think, well, okay, that gets registered in your brain, and then you think, okay, the woods are dangerous, and maybe I shouldn't go alone into the woods anymore where there are bears. And even if the actual risk of a bear attack is really small, the way the brain works is that it creates a sort of groove that sort of incorporates this new risky behavior and comes up with this other formulation of how we should act. But you add those up over a lifetime, those sort of anecdotal stories, and eventually the range of your choices gets more and more limited. And so, to me, it's part of the challenge of getting older, and I'm 40 now, is not letting those sort of red flags actually dictate the course. It doesn't mean you're reckless, but that you try to just be a little more thoughtful about it. Does that make sense, John?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Just managing them better, I guess.
Yeah.
What I guess maybe professionally as an author or a writer-like person, or I don't know, anything in your life, what feels like a risk to you right now? What kind of choices are you making that feel like risks?
Well, yeah. So I as you said, I have two kids, and you have a child too, right?
Yeah, I have one biological and one stepson and one nephew who is really sort of like another son to me. So.
Right. And they, like, probably for me, like, when you're making a big life choice, like, that's a central part of the equation, right? Those guys?
Yeah.
So for me, like, physical risks are much scarier than they used to be. Professional risks, I'm okay with. For me, it was a thrill to publish this book, and and it's given me, I feel like, a little more confidence to try different things. But when it comes to actually putting my life in danger, that seems really uncool when you got young kids, right?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
So it's I did hear, when it comes to aging, I did hear somebody say, and that person may have been my wife, actually. She said something like, you always, you want to sort of enjoy each phase for what it has to offer. And I think a lot of us are always thinking about the next phase, and which is not unreasonable, but at the detriment sometimes of the present. So like I remember when I was in junior high, I just wanted to get to high school. In high school, I was like, man, just get me to college. And in college, I was like, I got to get into the real world. But each one of those phases has some like unique challenges, but also really cool things about it. And so to not get too hung up and sort of always positioning and preparing for the future, but to really enjoy where you're at the time. And when we got young kids like we do, like that's there's a lot to enjoy too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not that you want to talk about a next phase, but I am sort of curious. Do you have plans to write more books?
Yeah. Right now, I am starting to work on a book about, I don't know what it's going to be called, but it's about borders and walls and how they fail, basically. And okay. So like when the Mongol horde finally came to the Great Wall of China, they just bribed a guard. And I was talking to a reporter the other day from South Texas who said that they were building a wall through the city of McAllen on the border. And he said they couldn't find anybody who wanted to do the work locally, so they had to hire illegal immigrants to build the wall, which is kind of like mind-blowing. And so I think later this year I'm gonna hike part of the Alaska-Canada border, and so there's a section called the Swath. It's 650 miles long, and it's dead straight in the sort of northern part of Alaska and Canada, and the U.S. government mows it 20 feet across, and it goes up and over mountains, across valleys, and the whole friggin' thing is mowed. And so I'm just going to sort of hike that as a way of sort of an entry point into sort of borders and the sort of role that they play and don't play in our lives.
Huh. Fascinating. I mean, at some point you go to bed, you're laying in bed. What kind of stuff do you think about at night, or what keeps you up at night, or what? What are the issues of life that you're chewing on right now, aside from borders?
Yeah. I think there's it's hard not to like think about politics right now, right? I mean,
as you talk about
crazy.
walls, as you're talking about walls made of maybe orange hair or something.
Yeah. I often think about like, and I know your show isn't political, but man, there's so much happening right now. I feel like it's still an important topic. What I can't tell, and maybe you have a sense, is like, is this like 1930s Italy? And because back then they thought like Mussolini was this buffoon and was harmless and would never get anywhere, or is it like is this like George Wallace, and we're getting all worked up about something that ends up being a footnote, a sad footnote in our history? And I can see arguments for both. So I think about like, oh gosh, should I be getting arrested right now so that I can someday tell my kids like, well, I got arrested at an anti-Trump protest, and as opposed to like, I just read the newspaper and was kind of concerned about it. I don't know. That's what I've been thinking about. What do you think about it at night?
Well, I have been thinking a lot about politics, and I try to stay almost apolitical in public forum, but I can say that some of this all feels like short-term, presidential candidates. I mean, they come in, they make policy, they do things, but I'm really concerned about their connection to Supreme Court appointments, because those last forever. And I'm not the most politically astute guy, but I know that a lifelong appointment is, much scarier to me than, 4 years or 8 years. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, and campaign finance reform, because I feel like no matter which end of the political spectrum you're on, because I don't think anyone's in the middle anymore, apparently, I feel like, campaign finance reform is, I think, maybe the most nonpartisan way of approaching changes in politics. And I don't usually feel comfortable telling people what they should or shouldn't believe, but I do feel comfortable in and maybe suggesting that if your opinion has already been bought away from you, that's a problem, whether it's by a conservative or a liberal party. It doesn't matter to me so much. That's not how I thought it was supposed to work. I think about that a lot. And I also wonder about, is it ever too late to take risks, which is why I ask people like you, because I'm trying to farm out some good answers. And I also think about the power of narrative, which is something that never dawned on me until I hit about 35 years old, that even stories with bad facts in them are more compelling than, bad stories with good facts. And so I'm trying to think about what is the point of all that. Do we need accurate documentaries to make social change, or do we need to just tell better stories? So those are things I've been wondering about.
Yeah. Have you heard about George Lucas's proposed museum about narrative?
I have not. What is that all about?
Apparently he wants to spend some crazy amount of money, like $100 million building a museum in Chicago dedicated to storytelling.
Oh yeah, I did hear about it. Apparently Chicago wouldn't accept it, right?
Well, yeah. I think that's why it's in the news. But regardless of where he builds it, what a cool idea. What a really cool idea. I think we need that museum. That'd be neat.
Yeah, I didn't really realize what it was. I think I heard the newsworthy part, which was that someone said no. I didn't even talk about what it was.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. Those are things I'm thinking about. Do you share a lot of this stuff with your family when you think about it, or are you sort of a solitary thinker, or what?
Oh no, I talk a lot. So, I guess my 6-year-old and I are not engaging about the role of like story in society, but you do see with kids, and I'm sure you've seen this with yours too, is that you just the role, like there's something embedded, it feels like, in our nature that loves and needs stories, and it's cross-cultural and it's across time, and it's almost biological, our need for story, I think. What's your take on that?
I actually think that story is sort of the syntax of the mind. I don't even know how you process thoughts without, there was sort of the famous part of universal grammar. Everyone thinks with noun-like things and verb-like things in their mind, but I think to put them all together, it almost requires a story. And I just think that's how the mind puts things together. I've read some books on it that are probably on my academic bookshelf somewhere, but the short answer is I do think it's unavoidable. And yet I don't think we tap into it very well. I mean, pie charts usually don't tell a great story, but they get shown in infographics. Sometimes they tell a story, but
yeah, exactly. The good ones do. The good ones have this whole story. I remember this one you're talking about graphs. I had it on my wall for a while. It was a graphic of Napoleon's march to Russia, and so like some people consider it like the best infographic of all time. And it was like done by a graphic designer, a draftsman who was in the Napoleon's army, but it has something like 6 different variables all charted, but the main one is this band that shows the size of his army, and on the far eastern side when he starts, it's like 3 inches thick, and as it gets closer and closer to Moscow, it becomes like a 2 millimeter thick, and then you see this like tiny thread on the return, and so you have time plotted and the size of the army and distance and temperature and a couple of other things, and that in one graphic is an incredibly rich story. So I think I don't think we do graphics very well, but occasionally we do them extraordinarily well, I think.
Yeah. Well, I guess you're giving me some optimism that there's better ways to visualize information that tell stories, and it seems like in our modern world, you get less and less time to do it. So maybe better infographics are the sort of the. Maybe that's the new syntax of the mind.
But where they probably won't be being discussed is in podcasts, which is a hard place to describe visual display of information.
Yeah, it is. Funny you should mention that. I'm trying to set up an interview with a few visual artists right now, and I'm not really sure how to talk about the work. It's sort of they always say these statements like, "I'm chasing the ephemeral feeling of Arvo Pärt," or something like that with my color pattern, and I don't really know what it means. You kind of have to look at it to see it. And yet I want to talk with these people about what's in their minds, but I'm not sure if it's going to translate to sound. Well, we'll see. Maybe I'll post something on a website, sort of an addendum for those particular podcasts.
There you go.
I wanted to ask you, it sounds like you haven't lost all hope for the world. Maybe a little disillusioned and you're more cynical. But I'm wondering, given all of these new things that you've learned through your experiences and things that, you have under your belt now, do you feel maybe more capable, or maybe like you would want to tackle some intractable problems, or do you just feel better about focusing on your priorities now?
Yeah, that.
That you kind of mentioned that about should I go get arrested or should I just read the paper? But
right, gosh, that is you turn 40 and maybe your perspective on the kinds of challenges that we or that an individual can help tackle, maybe that changes. I do find the scope of my sort of ambition getting more focused and more local and smaller. But at the same time, our problems are sort of, are getting larger and broader in scale. So, that's probably a mistake. When I think about this, my time in the Pacific out there and how, and now that I'm back, there are some things that I have tried to stay true to, and regardless of what project I'm working on, but the first is really to avoid, try to avoid the time-sucking illusion that loyalty to bad choices will somehow make them better. My experience, commitment to bad choices just makes them worse, right? Don't you think?
Yeah, well, that's one of those gambling fallacies that, if you just keep betting on a losing streak, you're bound to win.
Yeah, exactly.
When actually the odds might be stacked against you, and you should just walk away before you lose it all. Yeah. I'm with you on that. That's a question I wrestled with in my last decade, which was, when is it okay to throw in the towel so you can go do something else? There's a lot of talk about people that are stubborn and will not give up. And, there's something about that tenacity and that grit that we all admire, except sometimes you just need to be smart enough to say, yeah, that's not working. I'm going to try something else now.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's a balance, and having the sort of wisdom to try to get that right is really a challenge. I totally agree. I think one way to sidestep that problem, though, is to stay focused on the things you actually care about, and not pursue other people's goals or you think that other people want you to pursue. And if you keep it sounds hokey, but if you keep the sort of the big picture priorities in mind, then the sort of the other choices kind of sort of become a little clearer, I think. But that's easier to say than to do. I don't really know.
Yeah. Well, I will say this, and I'm curious if you agree. I think when you're excited about something and you're working towards your priority, I don't know hardly anything about podcasting, but I just decided to start. And it seems like every door I knock on, people open it up and say yes. And I'm really grateful, but it just seems like maybe when you're on the right path, the universe aligns a little too. I'm sure there's some famous quotes about that. But I've had experience also in life where I'm not working on something that's a priority to me, and maybe I have to for financial reasons or whatever. But, the doors don't open. And I was wondering, when you're working on stuff that you really care about, do you sense the doors opening? Or do you get that sensation too?
Doors don't always open for me. Although, I did have and I like the way you think about it, and I hope that's true. I did have I had a professor in writing school who made it his goal to get 100 rejections a year. And for him, if he wasn't getting rejected, that meant he wasn't putting himself out there. And with this goal of getting 100, that meant that everyone he got, he was closer towards reaching his goal. It's kind of an inverted way of thinking about things. But, I agree with you. Like the fact that you took up this podcast, there were probably 100 reasons why you shouldn't have started a podcast, or why you could have thought it wasn't a good idea. But I think part of, I don't know, being happy is not getting too tangled up in your own underpants and worried about if you're doing the right thing and all the reasons you shouldn't. And because I think that when it comes to the big choices, the big decisions, we're all just beginners anyways.
We're all just beginners anyways. I like that. That may get snipped out for promotional reasons later. So I'm kind of closing up on the questions that I had to ask you, that I wanted to ask you anyway. And I'm curious, for listeners out there, do you have any advice that you might want to give somebody who thinks that there's more to life, but they're not sure how or if they should take a plunge into the unknown?
Yeah, I guess the big one is just not to listen to the experts, or at least seek out the opinion of others and listen to it, but think about it for about like 15 minutes, and then do what you think you need to do that is consistent with your sort of priorities as you understand them. And it's also you don't have to make these huge risky life changes if you don't let your life get off track. So just part of what I learned out there and what I'm still like trying to practice is just to recalibrate sometimes. And so, you can just go like on vacation to an island instead of moving to an island. And it doesn't have to, you don't even have to recalibrate, in Hawaii. You can do it like in the grocery store line. Like, am I making the cumulative small life choices that will add up into something that is consistent with what is important and meaningful to me? And just check in every once in a while with yourself. That's it. That's all I got.
Well, that sounds like pretty solid advice. I wanted to ask you, I've never interviewed an author before. Let me think about that. No, I haven't. I've never interviewed an author or a writer-like person before. And honestly, I don't even know what questions I'm supposed to be asking authors and writer-like people. If you were going to interview maybe your favorite author, what are maybe 3 or 4 questions that you might ask them? Oh,
that's interesting. Well, I guess I go back to what we were talking about earlier about like just asking questions I really want to know the answers to, which unless you're a great actor, which you may be, it seemed like you were really trying to ask questions you want to know the answers to personally, and sort of letting that guide your questions. To me, I as a writer, when I sort of meet other writers, I guess I'm interested in their creative process, and which we sort of touched on, and then I guess I'm always interested too in like the nuts and bolts of it, and which most listeners probably aren't. But like how did you get published, and what steps did you take, and what worked and what didn't work, and so I'm always interested in that stuff. But I think you nailed it. You just want to sort of ask what you want to know. I think it's great.
Good.
Great job.
Well, I'm glad that you approve.
No, I think your podcast has a really promising future. You got a great voice and a curious mind, and a high-speed internet connection. I think you can do this.
Oh man, I'm flattered. I hope you're right. I am having so much fun. So I really hope you're right. I'm going to wind up with my questions here. The last one I want to ask is, if people want to find out more about you or to purchase your book somehow, well, where would you like to direct them?
Well, they can go to my website, which is a beginner's guide to paradise.com. And they can send me a note. I love hearing. I get an email a day probably from a stranger, and that's the best part. Otherwise, it's just me and a computer in a cafe, and that's depressing. But I love hearing from people. So send me a note. Let me know what you're doing, and if you like the book or if you don't like the book, let me know.
Okay, you hear that, listeners? Go to the website. Send them a note. All right. Well, I don't have any more questions. Is there anything else that you? I mean, I have all the time you've got Anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think we covered it. I guess podcasts too are competing against Game of Thrones, and so we have to be mindful and respectful of people's time. So it's been a really great conversation. I really appreciate it too.
I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciated the book. I enjoyed it a heck of a lot, and I look forward to talking to you again soon, perhaps in person, perhaps over the Skype. Or maybe about a new book. Who knows? But let's keep in touch.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, John.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.
Groovy, man. Lucky episode 7's coming to a close. Many thanks to Alex for coming on the show. You can swing by makemoveswithjohn.com and look around for the blog post on Alex, get some more information about him, find some links so you can purchase his book. You can also find some more links to explore Tacuma Bradley's Unity Band. Episode 8's coming up pretty soon. That's going to be with Jason Verlinde, the publisher of the Fretboard Journal, one of my very favorite magazines. I think you'll enjoy it. Until then, take care of yourselves and remember, go out there and make moves.